There are stories from World War II that Hollywood never touched, events so unbelievable that if they appeared in a movie, audiences would call them fiction. This is one of them. Picture this: a Polish farmer, an ordinary man with calloused hands and dirt under his fingernails, makes a decision that will either save 8 human lives or get everyone killed. His solution? Hide an entire Jewish family inside a pit filled with liquid manure, submerged up to their necks in filth and feces, breathing through hollow reeds while Nazi dogs sniff just meters above their heads. This actually happened. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this farmer's name should be spoken in the same breath as Schindler, and why his story was buried for decades under layers of shame, silence, and the very same filth that kept his neighbors alive. Poland, 1942. The Nazi occupation has transformed the Polish countryside into a hunting ground where Jewish families are prey and neighbors are forced to become either heroes or executioners. There is no middle ground anymore. The German SS has installed a system so efficient, so ruthless, that it turns entire communities into surveillance machines. Every Pole knows the rule. Harboring Jews means death, not just for you, but for your entire family, sometimes your entire village. The Nazis have made examples enough that the message is clear as summer sky. Yet in a small farming village, whose name has been lost to time, about 50 kilometers from Lviv, a man named Józef decides that some rules are made to be broken. He is not a resistance fighter. He has no military training. He is simply a farmer who grows potatoes and raises pigs, a man whose entire world exists within the boundaries of his modest property. But Józef has something that even the SS cannot stamp out, a conscience that refuses to sleep. The German occupation of Poland is unlike anything the world has seen before. This is not merely war, it is industrial-scale genocide wrapped in bureaucratic efficiency. The Nazis have divided Poland into zones, and in the eastern territories where Józef lives, the elimination of Jewish populations is happening with terrifying speed. Entire communities that existed for centuries are being erased in weeks. The process is methodical. First comes the ghetto, then comes the resettlement, which everyone knows is a death sentence disguised in paperwork. By late 1942, most Polish Jews are already dead or imprisoned, and the few who remain are either in hiding or running. The SS knows this. They know that rural farms offer perfect hiding spots, barns with false walls, root cellars with hidden doors, attics with concealed spaces. So they have adapted. They bring dogs, German shepherds trained specifically to detect the scent of terrified humans, and they bring Ukrainian collaborators who know the local terrain better than any German officer ever could. Józef's farm sits at the edge of the village, a strategic location that is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is privacy, the curse is exposure. When the Gestapo comes through the area on their routine cleansing operations, they always check the outlying properties first. Józef has already been visited twice, his barn torn apart, his fields walked by men in black uniforms who speak German with the casual tone of people discussing the weather while they decide who lives and who dies. Each time they find nothing. Each time Józef stands there with his hat in his hands, playing the role of the simple, compliant farmer, while his heart hammers against his ribs like a prisoner trying to break free. Because Józef is hiding something, not in his barn, not in his attic, but in plain sight in the most ingenious and disgusting hiding place imaginable, his manure pit. This is not a small container. This is a massive excavation beside his pig barn, roughly 4 meters wide and 3 meters deep, filled with liquid waste from months of animal husbandry. The smell alone is enough to keep anyone at a safe distance. The Nazis, despite their thoroughness, despite their dogs, have a weakness. They are still human beings who recoil from filth. The family Józef is hiding is the Sternberg family. A father named David, a mother named Miriam, their 3 children aged 6 to 14, David's elderly mother, and 2 cousins who escaped from a transport train 3 months earlier. 8 people total. 8 Jewish souls who were supposed to be dead by now, who should have been shot in the forest or gassed in Belzec, but instead are living in conditions that most would consider worse than death. They spend their days and nights partially submerged in human and animal waste, breathing through hollowed-out reeds that Józef carved himself, their bodies covered in crude waterproof sheets made from oilcloth that barely keep the liquid filth from their mouths. They cannot speak, they cannot cough, they cannot cry. When the SS comes, which happens every few weeks without warning, they submerge completely, holding their breath for as long as humanly possible while the dogs circle above, barking and sniffing, confused by the overwhelming stench that masks everything else. This is not a story about comfort or dignity. This is a story about what human beings will endure to survive and what one man will risk to help them do it. Józef knows that discovery means death for everyone, not a quick death. The SS has special punishments for Poles who hide Jews, public hangings, torture, sometimes burning entire families alive in their own homes as a lesson to others. Yet every morning Józef wakes up, feeds his pigs, milks his cow, and then walks to the manure pit with a bucket of food scraps and fresh water. Every morning, he checks to make sure all 8 of them are still breathing. And every morning he prays that today will not be the day the dogs figure out what that smell is really hiding. The question that haunted Józef, the question that will haunt you after this video, is simple. How long can you hold your breath when death is sniffing right above your head? The descent into this nightmare began on a cold October night in 1942, when David Sternberg appeared at Józef's door with terror written across his face and mud caked on his boots up to his knees. David was not a stranger. Before the war, he had been Józef's neighbor, a Jewish shopkeeper who sold fabric and thread in the village market, a man who had shared vodka with Józef during harvest festivals and whose wife Miriam had once helped deliver Józef's stillborn daughter when the midwife could not be found. These were not abstract people from another world. These were friends. That night, David did not need to explain much. The Lviv ghetto had been liquidated. Thousands shot, thousands more loaded onto trains. His family had escaped through a sewer system that ran beneath the ghetto walls, crawling through human waste for 6 hours until they emerged in the forest outside the city. They had been walking for 3 days, sleeping in ditches, drinking from streams, watching the road for any sign of patrols. David's hands shook as he spoke, and his voice cracked when he said the words that would change everything. Józef, we have nowhere else to go. Józef faced an impossible choice, the kind that reveals what a person is truly made of when all the comfortable illusions are stripped away. He could turn them away, which meant condemning 8 people to certain death, but keeping his own family safe. He could hide them in traditional ways, in the barn or the cellar, which might work for days or weeks, but would eventually fail when the dogs came or when a neighbor noticed something unusual. Or he could do something so audacious, so repulsive, that no German soldier would ever think to look there. Józef chose the third option. He walked David out to the pig barn, past the animals grunting in their pens, and showed him the manure pit. The smell hit them like a physical force even from 5 meters away. David's face went white. Józef said only this: "It is the only place they will never search thoroughly." David looked at the pit, looked back at Józef, and understood that this was not cruelty. This was mercy disguised as madness. This was survival at its most primal and undignified. The preparation took 2 days of secret work that had to be done entirely at night. Józef constructed a crude breathing system using hollowed bamboo reeds that he normally used for fishing, each one approximately 1 meter long, just enough to reach from below the surface to the air above. He fashioned waterproof covers from old tarpaulins and oilcloth, material he had used for covering hay bales, now repurposed to create crude protective layers that would keep the liquid waste from entering mouths and noses. He built a submerged wooden platform, barely 30 centimeters below the surface of the filth, where the family could stand rather than having to tread constantly in the muck. Every detail mattered. Every measurement could mean the difference between survival and drowning in excrement. Józef tested the system himself first, lowering his own body into the pit, feeling the cold liquid filth rise up his chest, his neck, until only his head remained above. He breathed through the reed. It worked barely, the air coming in thin and foul, but sufficient to sustain life. On the 3rd night, the Sternberg family entered their new home. Miriam went first, lowering herself slowly into the pit while Józef held her hand, her face frozen in an expression beyond disgust, beyond fear. into some territory where the human mind simply shuts down to protect itself. The children followed, the youngest crying silently, tears mixing with filth as they descended. David's mother, 73 years old and arthritic, had to be lowered by rope because she could not climb down on her own. 8 people, arranged in a circle on the submerged platform, each holding their breathing reed, each covered in their protective cloth, each now residents of hell. Józef looked down at them one final time before covering the pit with loose wooden planks and scattered straw to make it look undisturbed. He could see their eyes, the only part of them still visible above the muck, and in those eyes he saw something that would haunt him forever, gratitude mixed with the complete destruction of human dignity. The routine that followed was mechanical and necessarily cruel. Every morning before dawn, Józef would remove the camouflage, bring them a bucket of well water for drinking and a bucket of food scraps, whatever he could spare without arousing suspicion from his own family or neighbors. They would have exactly 15 minutes to eat, drink, stretch their cramped muscles, and relieve themselves over the side of the platform into the very filth they stood in. Then back under, back to the reeds, back to standing perfectly still for 23 hours and 45 minutes each day. They could not speak during daylight, they could not cough, they could not move suddenly. Any disturbance of the surface might be visible to a passing patrol or a curious neighbor. At night, Józef would sometimes allow them to whisper to each other, and through the darkness he would hear Miriam singing lullabies to her children in Yiddish, her voice so soft it was barely a breath, a mother's desperate attempt to preserve some fragment of normalcy in a world that had gone completely insane. The first test came exactly 11 days after the Sternbergs entered the pit, when the SS arrived without warning on a grey November morning with 6 Ukrainian collaborators and 4 German shepherds straining against their leashes. Józef was in his kitchen drinking chicory coffee when he heard the trucks rumbling down the dirt road, their engines growing louder until they stopped directly in front of his property. His blood turned to ice water. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, but now that it was happening, his hands trembled so badly he could barely set down his cup. Through the window he watched the soldiers dismount, watched the dogs immediately begin sniffing the ground with methodical precision, watched an SS officer in an immaculate uniform light a cigarette and survey the farm with the bored expression of a man who had done this so many times, it no longer held any interest. Józef forced himself to walk outside slowly, casually, like a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear, except the natural terror any Polish farmer felt when the SS came calling. The officer spoke to him in broken Polish, asking the standard questions with mechanical efficiency. How many people lived here? Just Józef and his sister. Any employees? No, the farm was too small. Had he seen any suspicious activity, any strangers, any Jews trying to find shelter? No, sir, nothing like that. This was a quiet area. Nothing ever happened here. The officer nodded, clearly uninterested in the answers, and gestured for his men to begin the search. They moved through the property like locusts, tearing through the barn, overturning hay bales, probing the walls for hollow spaces, climbing into the loft to check the rafters. The dogs went everywhere, their noses pressed to the ground, their handlers letting them range freely across the entire farm. Józef watched them approach the pig barn, watched them get within 10 meters of the manure pit, and felt his heart stop completely. This was the moment. This was where 8 people would either continue breathing or die screaming. The dogs reached the edge of the pit and immediately recoiled, their sensitive noses overwhelmed by the concentrated stench of months-old pig waste mixed with chicken droppings and decomposing organic matter. They whined and pulled backward on their leashes, refusing to approach closer. One dog actually vomited on the spot. The handlers laughed, making jokes in Ukrainian about the disgusting Polish farmers and their primitive waste management. One of them, a young man who could not have been older than 20, called out to the SS officer and pointed at the pit, saying something in German that Józef did not understand, but whose meaning was clear from the dismissive wave of the officer's hand. The officer walked over, took one look at the festering pool of filth, wrinkled his nose in theatrical disgust, and turned away without a second glance. He said something to his men that made them laugh, probably a joke about Polish hygiene, and just like that they moved on to search the vegetable garden and the chicken coop. Beneath the surface of that pit, 8 people stood frozen in absolute silence, their breathing reeds barely breaking the surface tension of the liquid waste, their lungs burning from holding partial breaths to minimize any visible disturbance. They could hear everything: the boots crunching on gravel, the dogs barking and whining, the guttural laughter of the soldiers, the scraping sound of barn doors being forced open. Miriam held her 6-year-old daughter pressed against her body, one hand clamped gently but firmly over the child's mouth, even though the little girl knew better than to make a sound, even though they had practiced this exact scenario every night for 11 days. David's elderly mother had her eyes closed and her lips moving in silent prayer, reciting the Shema over and over in her mind while filth lapped at her chin. The 2 teenage boys stood perfectly still, their young bodies adapted more quickly than the adults to the horror of their situation, their faces blank and emotionless in the way that children develop when childhood itself becomes impossible. The search lasted 47 minutes, though to Józef it felt like 47 hours. The SS went through every structure, every potential hiding place, their efficiency born from years of practice hunting human beings like animals. They found nothing because there was nothing to find except 8 people breathing through reeds in a pool of shit, and even the best-trained dogs in the Reich could not overcome their own biological revulsion. When the officer finally declared the search complete, when the trucks rumbled away down the road leaving clouds of dust in their wake, Józef stood motionless for another full hour, terrified that it might be a trick, that they might circle back to catch him relaxing his guard. Only when he was absolutely certain they were gone did he approach the pit, remove the camouflage, and look down at 8 pairs of eyes staring up at him. No one spoke. No one celebrated. They had survived the first test, but everyone understood with crystal clarity that this would not be the last time the dogs came sniffing. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came a cruelty that even Józef had not anticipated. The temperature in eastern Poland dropped to -15 degrees Celsius by mid-December, and the manure pit, despite being a biological mass that generated some heat through decomposition, began to freeze around the edges. Ice crystals formed on the surface each night, and by morning the Sternbergs would be standing in a partially frozen slurry that made their already unbearable situation almost unsurvivable. Józef watched helplessly as the children developed persistent coughs that they had to suppress during daylight hours, their small bodies shaking with the effort of holding in each convulsion. Miriam's lips turned blue from prolonged cold exposure, and David's mother developed frostbite on her fingers despite being submerged in waste that should have insulated her. As Józef brought them whatever warm clothes he could spare, crude wool blankets that became soaked and heavy within hours, but it was never enough. The cold was an enemy that could not be reasoned with or hidden from, and it was killing them slowly, degree by degree. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical suffering. Human beings are not designed to live in perpetual filth, to stand motionless for 23 hours a day, to exist in a state of permanent terror where a single cough or sneeze could trigger a death sentence. David's teenage son began showing signs of what we would now call severe depression, his eyes going vacant and unfocused, his responses to whispered questions becoming slower and more detached. The 6-year-old girl stopped speaking entirely, even during the brief nighttime periods when conversation was permitted, retreating into some internal space where the horror could not reach her. Miriam told Józef in a desperate whisper one night that she feared her children would survive the Nazis only to emerge from this pit as broken shells, their minds shattered beyond repair. Józef had no comfort to offer because he feared the exact same thing. He had saved their bodies, but he was watching their spirits die in increments, drowning not in the filth, but in the sheer impossibility of maintaining human consciousness under such conditions. The village around them continued its daily routines with practiced ignorance, neighbors going about their business, while 8 people stood neck-deep in excrement less than 50 meters away. Józef's own sister, who lived with him in the farmhouse, never asked questions she did not want answered. She noticed the extra food disappearing, noticed Józef's frequent trips to the pig barn at odd hours, noticed the haunted look in his eyes that grew more pronounced with each passing week, but she maintained a willful blindness that was itself a form of complicity. This was how ordinary people survived the occupation. by not seeing what was directly in front of them, by not hearing the screams that came from the forest at night, by not questioning why their Jewish neighbors had suddenly vanished. Józef understood this survival mechanism because he had used it himself before David appeared at his door. The difference was that now he could no longer unsee what was happening, could no longer pretend that turning away was a neutral act. The close calls became more frequent as winter deepened and German paranoia intensified. Twice more the SS came through with their dogs, and twice more the same miracle occurred. The overwhelming stench of the manure pit defeated the animals' tracking abilities. But there were other dangers beyond the official searches. Neighbors began to notice that Józef's pig barn seemed unusually active for winter, that he made more trips there than necessary for basic animal care. One old woman, a notorious gossip who had already reported 2 families for black market activities, stopped by one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing salt and spent 20 minutes peering around the property with undisguised suspicion. Józef had to physically position himself between her and the barn, engaging in trivial conversation about weather and crops, while his heart pounded and his mind raced through scenarios of what would happen if she decided to inform the authorities. She left eventually, but her eyes lingered on the pig barn a moment too long, and Józef knew he had added another name to the list of threats that kept him awake at night. By January of 1943, 3 months into their ordeal, the Sternberg family had developed a routine that was equal parts survival mechanism and slow surrender to madness. They stood in their assigned positions on the submerged platform, their bodies swaying slightly with exhaustion, their breathing reeds clutched in hands that had lost most of their sensation to cold and prolonged moisture exposure. David had stopped asking Józef how much longer this would last because both men knew there was no answer to that question. The war would end when it ended. The Nazis would leave when they were defeated or when they had killed everyone they came to kill. Until then, the pit was home, and home was a circle of hell that Dante never imagined, because even his darkest visions of the inferno included the dignity of fire and brimstone, not this slow rotting in frozen sewage while the world above continued as if nothing was wrong. The breaking point came on a February morning when David's mother simply stopped responding. She had been standing in her position, reed in hand, her elderly body subjected to 4 months of conditions that would have killed most people in weeks, and something inside her finally gave out. Miriam noticed first during the pre-dawn feeding, whispering urgently to Józef that the old woman's eyes were open but unseeing, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin cold even by the standards of their frozen hell. Józef climbed down into the pit for the first time since the family had entered, the filth rising up his legs and torso as he waded to where she stood, and he knew immediately that she was dying. Her pulse was weak and thready, her lips moving in silent prayer or delirium, her body temperature dangerously low. There was no doctor who could be called, no hospital that would admit a Jewish woman even if transportation were possible. Józef could only hold her upright, keep her head above the surface and wait for the inevitable. She died 3 hours later, still standing, still holding her breathing reed, her final words in Yiddish that only her family understood, Shema Yisrael. The problem of what to do with her body revealed the full grotesque horror of their situation. They could not give her a proper burial without exposing the entire operation. They could not simply leave her in the pit because decomposition would accelerate disease and make the already unbearable smell even worse. Józef made the hardest decision of his life. Under cover of complete darkness, he and David removed her body from the pit, wrapped it in burlap sacking, and buried her in an unmarked grave at the furthest corner of the property, beneath a dead oak tree where the frozen ground had to be broken with a pickaxe. They worked in total silence, David's tears freezing on his cheeks as he lowered his mother into the earth without prayers, without ceremony, without any of the rituals that Jewish tradition demanded. When it was done, they covered the grave with leaves and branches to hide the disturbed soil, and David returned to the pit, where his wife and children waited. He never spoke of his mother again, because speaking of her meant acknowledging that she had died not from Nazi bullets, but from the very method that was supposed to save her. Spring brought a different kind of torture. As the weather warmed, The manure pit became a breeding ground for insects that swarmed in clouds so thick they blocked out the sun. Flies laid eggs in the filth, maggots wriggled through the waste, mosquitoes bred in the stagnant pools at the edges. The Sternbergs had to stand motionless while insects crawled across their faces, into their ears, around their eyes, biting exposed skin until they were covered in welts and infected sores. The children suffered the worst, their young skin more sensitive, their immune systems compromised by months of malnutrition and exposure. Józef brought what primitive medications he could find, iodine and sulfur powder, but applying medicine to bodies that were constantly submerged in contaminated waste was an exercise in futility. Infections developed despite every precaution. Miriam's daughter developed a fever that lasted 2 weeks, her small body burning while she stood in cold filth, delirious but forced to remain silent and motionless during daylight hours. The mental deterioration accelerated in ways that were almost worse than the physical decay. David's teenage son began having episodes where he would forget where he was, speaking out loud in the middle of the day about wanting to go home, wanting to see the sun, wanting to die rather than continue. His father would have to grab him, force his head under the surface briefly to shock him back to reality, a brutal form of discipline that was the only option when any sound could bring the SS running. The 6-year-old girl, who had stopped speaking months earlier, developed a habit of humming tunelessly to herself, a sound so soft it was barely audible, but dangerous nonetheless. Miriam would press her hand over her daughter's mouth gently, repeatedly, trying to condition the child to silence, but the humming would return within hours, like a symptom of a disease that could not be cured. They were losing themselves piece by piece, their humanity eroding not from cruelty, but from the simple impossibility of maintaining sanity under such conditions. Yet somehow they endured. 6 months became 7, 7 became 8. The summer of 1943 arrived with heat that turned the pit into a fetid soup, the smell intensifying to levels that even Józef could barely tolerate. The Sternbergs stood in their positions, their skin permanently stained and wrinkled from constant immersion, their bodies skeletal from malnutrition, their minds operating in a fugue state somewhere between consciousness and complete dissociation. Józef continued his daily routine, bringing food and water, removing waste when possible, maintaining the fiction to his neighbors that everything was normal, while 8 people slowly transformed into something barely recognizable as human. The war ground on with no end in sight, the Nazis still firmly in control, the death camps still operating at full capacity. Every day that the Sternbergs survived was a miracle, but miracles extracted a price that could never be fully calculated or repaid. The autumn of 1943 brought news that filtered through the village in whispers and coded conversations. The tide of war was shifting. The Germans had suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, the Soviets were pushing westward, and the entire Nazi apparatus in Eastern Europe was beginning to show cracks. But for the Sternbergs, this distant hope meant nothing except the possibility of increased danger as desperate SS units intensified their final sweeps for remaining Jews, determined to complete their extermination mission before retreat became necessary. Józef heard from a traveling merchant that entire villages were being burned in reprisal operations, that the Nazis were executing anyone suspected of harboring Jews without even the pretense of investigation. The endgame was approaching, and paradoxically, this made survival even more precarious. The Sternbergs had lasted nearly a year in conditions that defied human endurance, and now, with liberation potentially months away, the risk of discovery was higher than ever. The closest call came on a cold October afternoon when a Wehrmacht unit, retreating from Soviet advances, commandeered Józef's farm as a temporary staging post. 30 German soldiers set up camp in his barn, in his fields, and uncomfortably close to the pig barn where 7 people stood frozen in terror beneath the filth. The soldiers were there for 3 days, 3 endless days, during which Józef could not approach the pit to deliver food or water, could not check if everyone was still alive, could not do anything except pray that nobody would investigate the manure pit too closely. The Sternbergs, meanwhile, stood in complete silence and absolute stillness for 72 hours straight, their breathing reeds their only connection to life, their bodies shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. They urinated and defecated where they stood because there was no alternative. They hallucinated from dehydration and hunger. David later told Józef that he watched his wife's eyes glaze over completely on the second day, her consciousness retreating to some place beyond reach, her body operating on pure survival instinct without any higher brain function. When the Wehrmacht unit finally moved out, heading west toward what they hoped would be safer defensive positions, Józef ran to the pit with a desperation that bordered on panic. He tore away the camouflage and looked down to see 7 faces staring up at him with expressions that no longer registered as fully human. They were alive, technically, their hearts still beating and their lungs still drawing air through the reeds, but something fundamental had changed. The year-long ordeal had transformed them into creatures of pure survival, stripped of everything except the most basic biological imperative to continue existing. Józef lowered buckets of water and they drank like animals, without pause, without thank you, without any social niceties because those parts of their brains had been shut down to preserve core functions. He understood in that moment that even if they survived the war, even if liberation came tomorrow, these people would never fully recover from what they had endured. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was the hardest yet, not because conditions worsened, but because the psychological reserves that had sustained the Sternbergs through the first year were completely depleted. They had nothing left to draw on, no hidden reserves of courage or hope, no mental tricks to make the endless standing and silence bearable. They simply existed in a state beyond suffering, their consciousness reduced to a dim awareness of cold and filth and the mechanical act of breathing. The teenage boy stopped responding to his name. Miriam's daughter regressed to infantile behaviors, sucking her thumb constantly, despite the filth coating her hands. David himself told Józef during one midnight feeding that he could no longer remember what his mother's face had looked like, could no longer recall the layout of his shop before the war, could no longer access memories that existed before the pit. The Manure pit was not just hiding them from the Nazis, it was erasing them as individuals, dissolving their identities in the same way it dissolved organic waste. Yet Józef continued. Every morning, every evening, through snow and rain and the bitter cold that turned his fingers numb and made each trip to the barn an exercise in endurance. He continued, because stopping meant letting them die. And letting them die meant admitting that the last year of horror had been for nothing. His sister finally confronted him one night, demanding to know what he was hiding in the pig barn, and he told her the truth because he was too exhausted to maintain the lie anymore. She stood in stunned silence for a full minute, then simply said, "May God forgive us all," and never mentioned it again. She began helping with the food preparation, setting aside extra portions without comment, becoming an unwitting accomplice to a rescue operation that had long since transformed into something resembling a slow-motion crucifixion where the goal was not salvation but merely postponing death one day at a time. The breakthrough came not with trumpets or celebration, but with the distant rumble of Soviet artillery that began shaking the ground in March of 1944. The Red Army was advancing faster than anyone had anticipated, pushing the Wehrmacht into chaotic retreat, and the entire Nazi administrative structure in eastern Poland was collapsing like a house built on sand. The SS units that had terrorized the region for years were now scrambling to destroy evidence and flee westward before Soviet tanks arrived. Józef heard the explosions growing closer each day, saw the roads clogged with retreating German convoys, watched as Ukrainian collaborators, who had enthusiastically hunted Jews for 3 years, suddenly tried to blend back into the Polish population as if nothing had happened. The liberation was coming, but it was coming with Soviet brutality that offered its own set of dangers. The Red Army was not arriving as saviors, they were arriving as conquerors who had their own scores to settle and their own casual disregard for Polish life. The last German patrol came through the village on March 23rd, a ragged unit of SS and Wehrmacht soldiers mixed together in desperate retreat, their uniforms dirty and their eyes hollow with the knowledge of impending defeat. They were no longer searching for Jews, they were simply trying to survive long enough to reach German lines. But habit and cruelty die hard, and the officer in charge, a scarred veteran who had probably participated in thousands of executions, decided to conduct one final search of Józef's farm as an almost reflexive action. The dogs were gone, likely eaten or abandoned during the retreat, which meant this search would be conducted by human eyes alone. The soldiers spread out across the property with less enthusiasm than previous raids, going through the motions, but clearly eager to move on. One young soldier, who could not have been older than 17, approached the manure pit, looked at the festering surface with undisguised revulsion, and actually laughed at the absurdity of Polish farming conditions. He called out to his sergeant, made a crude joke about Polish hygiene, and walked away without a second glance. Beneath that surface, the Sternbergs stood in their positions for what would be the final time, their breathing reeds clutched in hands that had long since lost all feeling, their bodies operating on pure muscle memory after 17 months of this routine. They did not know this was the last patrol. They had no way of knowing that the war was ending, that liberation was days away, that their impossible ordeal was finally approaching its conclusion. They simply stood, as they had stood for 512 days, waiting for either death or dawn. Miriam had stopped counting days months ago. David had stopped praying. The children had stopped being children in any meaningful sense of the word. They were survivors in the most technical and brutal definition of that term, organisms that had continued metabolizing and respirating despite every biological and psychological reason to simply give up and sink beneath the surface. The soldiers left within an hour, the last Nazi boots to ever touch Józef's property, the final echo of an occupation that had turned all of Poland into an abattoir. Józef watched them disappear down the road, heading west toward a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered, and he felt nothing. No relief, no joy, no sense of victory. He was too exhausted for emotion, too hollowed out by 17 months of constant terror to process what this moment meant. He walked to the farmhouse in a daze, sat at his kitchen table, and simply stared at the wall for an unknown period of time. His sister found him there, and had to physically shake him back to awareness, reminding him that 7 people were still standing in the pit, still waiting for the signal that it was safe to emerge. But was it safe? The Germans were gone, but the Soviets were coming, and who knew what their arrival would bring? 2 days later, on March 25, 1944, Soviet tanks rolled into the village with red stars painted on their hulls, and crews who looked as exhausted and brutalized as everyone else. There was no grand liberation ceremony, no speeches about freedom, just soldiers securing the area and immediately requisitioning supplies from farms that had already been stripped bare by German occupation. Józef approached a Soviet officer, a hard-faced man who listened to his story about the hidden Jews with an expression of complete indifference. The officer shrugged and said in broken Polish that Józef should bring them out if they were still alive, but the Red Army had no resources for refugees, and they would have to fend for themselves. That was it. No gratitude, no recognition, no acknowledgement that what Józef had done was anything special. The war had created so many horrors and so many small acts of resistance that one Polish farmer saving 7 Jews barely registered as noteworthy in the grand calculus of suffering. The moment of emergence was not triumphant or joyful, but rather a scene of profound horror that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Józef approached the manure pit on the morning of March 26, 1944, removed the camouflage for the final time, and told the Sternbergs in a voice that cracked with emotion that the Nazis were gone and they could come out. There was no immediate response. The 7 figures standing in the filth did not move, did not react, as if the words were in a language they no longer understood. Józef had to repeat himself 3 times, had to physically reach down and touch David's shoulder before any recognition flickered in their eyes. Then, slowly, with movements that were stiff and mechanical after 17 months of enforced stillness, they began to climb out. David came first, his body so caked in dried waste that he was barely recognizable as human, his skin mottled with sores and infections, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. Miriam followed, helping her children one by one, each of them moving like elderly people despite their youth, their joints locked and their muscles atrophied from endless standing. When the 6-year-old girl finally emerged into daylight for the first time in over a year, she immediately collapsed, her eyes unable to tolerate the brightness of a cloudy March morning, her legs unable to support her weight on solid ground. She lay on the dirt, convulsing and vomiting, her body rejecting the sudden change in environment as violently as if she had been poisoned. The teenage boy came out last and simply stood there swaying, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his brain unable to process the concept of space and movement after so many months of forced immobility in a confined area. Józef and his sister had prepared buckets of clean water, had set up a makeshift bathing area in the barn, but the Sternbergs could not be cleaned in a single washing or even a dozen. The filth had penetrated so deeply, had become so integrated with their skin and hair and clothing, that removing it was like trying to scrape away layers of their actual bodies. They scrubbed for hours, the water in the buckets turning black and putrid, and still they were not clean. The physical transformation was shocking, but the psychological damage was even more profound. The Sternbergs could not speak coherently for the first 3 days after emerging. Words came out garbled and confused, their vocal cords unused to forming sounds after months of enforced silence, their minds unable to organize thoughts into linear communication. Miriam sat in Józef's kitchen wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her daughter clutched to her chest, and simply rocked back and forth without speaking, her eyes vacant and staring at something only she could see. David tried to thank Józef, but the words dissolved into incoherent sobbing that lasted for nearly an hour, his body shaking with the release of 17 months of suppressed emotion. The teenage boy sat in a corner and refused to eat, refused to drink, refused to acknowledge that he was no longer in the pit, convinced on some fundamental level that this was a hallucination or a trick, and that he would wake up back in the filth with a breathing reed in his hand. The village's reaction to their emergence was a mixture of shock, disgust, and carefully maintained ignorance. Neighbors who had lived 50 meters away for 17 months suddenly claimed they had no idea anyone was being hidden, that they had never suspected anything unusual, that Józef must have been incredibly secretive. The same old woman who had sniffed around his property months earlier now crossed herself and hurried past without making eye contact, her complicity in silence, something she would take to her grave without ever acknowledging. A few villagers brought food and clothing as quiet gestures of support, leaving items on Józef's doorstep without knocking or waiting for thanks. But most simply pretended the Sternbergs had materialized from nowhere, avoiding the uncomfortable questions about what they had known or suspected and what they had chosen not to see. This collective amnesia was its own form of violence, a second erasure that denied the Sternbergs even the acknowledgement of what they had survived. The Soviet occupation brought new dangers that made celebration impossible. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, were immediately suspicious of anyone who had survived the Nazi occupation in unusual circumstances, viewing resourceful survivors as potential threats or collaborators. Józef was questioned repeatedly about why he had hidden Jews when it would have been easier and safer to turn them in. The Soviet interrogators, unable to comprehend that someone might act purely from moral conviction rather than political calculation or personal gain. The Sternbergs themselves were classified as displaced persons with no legal status, no documentation, and no rights under the new Soviet administration. They could not return to their former home because it had been occupied by Polish families who refused to leave. They could not reclaim David's shop because there was no legal mechanism for Jews to recover property. They were alive, technically free, but they were also ghosts in a world that had moved on without them and had no place prepared for their return. The Sternbergs remained at Józef's farm for 6 weeks after liberation, not because they wanted to, but because they had literally nowhere else to go. The world they had known before the war no longer existed. The Jewish community of their village had been completely eradicated, over 2,000 people, reduced to mass graves in the forest and ashes in distant camps. Their extended family, dozens of aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents who had lived within a 20-kilometer radius before the war, were all dead. David's fabric shop was now a Polish grocery store whose owner showed them official Soviet paperwork proving legal ownership. Their former home housed a family of Ukrainian refugees who had themselves been displaced by the war and who looked at the Sternbergs with hostility rather than sympathy, seeing them as competitors for scarce resources rather than survivors of genocide. The Poland that emerged from Nazi occupation was not interested in restoring what had been taken from Jews. It was interested in forgetting that Jews had ever existed there at all. The physical recovery was slow and incomplete. Miriam developed chronic respiratory infections that would plague her for the rest of her life, her lungs permanently damaged by 17 months of breathing contaminated air through a hollow reed. David lost most of his teeth to malnutrition and infection, his gums so diseased that eating solid food became a painful ordeal. The children showed signs of developmental delays and psychological trauma that no amount of time or care could fully heal. The 6-year-old girl, who had stopped speaking in the pit, eventually regained the ability to talk, but never spoke about her time in hiding, maintaining a complete silence on the subject that lasted until her death 60 years later. The teenage boy developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, experiencing violent nightmares and panic attacks whenever he encountered strong smells or confined spaces. Modern therapy and psychiatric care might have helped them, but in 1944 rural Poland under Soviet occupation, such resources did not exist. They were expected to simply move on, to be grateful they had survived, to not burden others with the details of their suffering. In May of 1944, the Sternbergs made the decision to leave Poland entirely, joining the massive wave of Jewish refugees heading west toward displaced persons camps and eventual emigration. David came to Józef on the morning of their departure, and the two men stood facing each other in uncomfortable silence, both understanding that there were no words adequate to the situation. How do you thank someone for keeping you alive in a manure pit for 17 months? How do you express gratitude for a rescue that required you to surrender every shred of human dignity? David tried to speak several times, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged except a choked sob. Finally, he simply embraced Józef, holding him with desperate intensity, while both men wept openly, their tears mixing together in a moment of shared grief for everything that had been lost and everything that could never be recovered. Józef pressed into David's hand a small bundle containing what little money he had saved, knowing it would be refused and pressing it anyway, and David accepted it with a nod of acknowledgement that this too was part of the impossible calculus of survival. The Sternbergs walked away from the farm on a spring morning with everything they owned packed into 2 borrowed suitcases, 7 people who had entered a pit as a family and emerged as something else entirely. Józef watched them disappear down the road, the same road the Nazis had used 3 years earlier, when they arrived to transform Poland into a graveyard, and he felt an emptiness that no amount of pride or satisfaction could fill. He had saved 7 lives, an act of extraordinary courage that should have felt heroic and triumphant, but instead he felt only exhaustion and a profound sense of waste. He thought about David's mother buried under the oak tree without marker or ceremony. He thought about the 17 months of standing in filth, the systematic destruction of human dignity that survival had required. He thought about the fact that 7 people living was considered a victory when 2,000 people dying was the context. The mathematics of the Holocaust were obscene, and Józef's rescue, as remarkable as it was, could not balance the equation. In the weeks after the Sternbergs left, Józef filled in the manure pit, shoveling dirt and stone over the site where 7 people had stood for 512 days, burying the evidence of both their suffering and his courage. He burned the breathing reeds and the waterproof covers, destroying every trace of the hiding place as if erasing it from physical reality could somehow erase it from memory. His neighbors never asked what had happened to the Jewish family that had appeared and then disappeared from his farm, maintaining the same willful ignorance they had practiced during the occupation. Józef himself rarely spoke of it, carrying the weight of those 17 months in silence, a silence that mirrored the silence of the Sternbergs themselves as they tried to rebuild lives from the ruins of everything they had lost. The Sternberg family eventually made it to a displaced persons camp in Germany, then to Palestine in 1947, and finally to the newly established State of Israel in 1948. They rebuilt their lives with the determination of people who had already survived the unsurvivable, but the scars remained visible and invisible for the rest of their days. David became a shopkeeper again in Tel Aviv, recreating the modest existence he had known before the war, but he never spoke publicly about how he survived. Miriam raised her children and eventually her grandchildren, but she avoided enclosed spaces for the rest of her life and refused to use public restrooms or basements, her body carrying a permanent memory of 17 months in the pit. The children grew into adults who seemed functional on the surface, but who carried wounds that expressed themselves in unexpected ways, an inability to tolerate certain smells, an obsessive need for cleanliness, a terror of dogs that never diminished with time or reason. They were alive, they had families, they contributed to society, but they were also walking monuments to a trauma so profound that it had fundamentally altered their neurological and psychological architecture. Józef remained on his farm in Poland, living through the communist era as an unremarkable farmer whose extraordinary act of courage was known to almost no one. He never sought recognition or reward for what he had done, never contacted Holocaust organizations or documentation centers, never tried to claim the title of righteous among the nations that Israel bestowed on non-Jews who rescued Jews during the war. He simply continued farming, growing older and more silent with each passing year, the weight of his memories pressing down on him like stones on a grave. His sister died in 1962 without ever telling anyone about the family hidden in the manure pit. The villagers who had known or suspected something died one by one, taking their knowledge or their willful ignorance to their graves. By 1970, there was almost no one left alive who could confirm that the Sternberg family had ever existed or that Józef had saved them. The story would have died completely if not for a chance encounter in 1983, when one of David's granddaughters, a journalist researching Holocaust survivors in Israel, convinced her grandfather to finally tell his story. David was 78 years old, his health failing, and he agreed with the understanding that it would be published only after his death. He spoke for 6 hours, describing the manure pit in detail that was almost unbearable to hear, his voice flat and emotionless as he recounted 17 months of standing in filth while Nazi dogs sniffed overhead. When he finished, he asked his granddaughter to find Józef, to make sure the world knew what the Polish farmer had done, to ensure that his courage was not forgotten. By the time she traveled to Poland in 1985, Józef had been dead for 2 years, buried in the village cemetery under a simple stone that identified him only as a farmer, with no mention of the 7 lives he saved or the impossible choice he made on that October night in 1942. The granddaughter located the farm, which had been abandoned and was slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather. She found the spot where the manure pit had been, now just a depression in the ground filled with wild grass and wildflowers, and she stood there trying to imagine her grandfather standing neck-deep in waste with a breathing reed in his hand while the world continued around him. She could not imagine it. The human mind is not equipped to fully comprehend such extremes of suffering and endurance. She documented everything, interviewed the few remaining elderly villagers who admitted to vague memories of a Jewish family that had appeared after the war, and published an article that brought international attention to Józef's rescue. In 1987, Józef was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations, his name added to the wall at Yad Vashem alongside thousands of other non-Jews who risked everything to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. But here is the truth that every documentary and every commemoration struggles to convey. Józef's heroism was not clean or triumphant or inspiring in the way we want our heroes to be. It was grotesque and degrading and soul-destroying for everyone involved. 7 people survived, which is 7 more than would have survived if Józef had turned them away, but their survival required them to spend 17 months in conditions that stripped away every element of human dignity and left permanent scars on their bodies and minds. This is the reality of resistance during the Holocaust. It was not glamorous or noble. It was desperate and brutal, and often indistinguishable from torture. Józef saved lives by hiding people in a manure pit because that was the only option that the Nazis had left available, and the fact that it worked does not make it any less horrifying. We tell these stories not to celebrate the ingenuity of resistance, but to bear witness to the absolute depths of human cruelty that made such resistance necessary, and to honor the people who chose to act even when action required descending into hell alongside those they were trying to save. The Sternbergs lived. Józef lived. But what they lived through should never have been necessary. And remembering their story means remembering not just their courage, but the monstrous evil that forced ordinary people to make impossible choices between collaboration and conscience, between safety and salvation, between turning away and standing neck-deep in filth while the dogs of genocide sniffed overhead.